Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to start talking about chapter 13 and really sort of focusing on this idea of cell division in terms of its purpose for reproduction. And chapter 13 is going to focus mostly on reproduction in the form of sexual life cycles, which means we're also going to circle back around to meiosis and how do we create sex cells by cell division is going to look a little bit different for a lot of sexually reproducing organisms than it does when we talk about asexually reproducing organisms and their usage more often of mitosis as opposed to meiosis. So keep in mind that one of the hallmark goals of biology in general is to reproduce. We have to be able to send genetic information from one generation to the next. That's how we continue to perpetuate the species. So living organisms are very much distinguished by their ability to reproduce, which then ties into the genetics and the heredity and the variation that we see, which is also the underpinnings of all of evolution. And how do we change species over time? Well, it all comes back to their DNA, mutations that may happen, recombination of those genetics, and the natural selection working on the phenotypic level, the physical expression of those genes to then drive what genes get passed on. So when we talk about genetics, right, this is the scientific study of heredity and variation. So heredity is simply talking about the transmission of traits from one generation to the next, and that goes back to DNA sequencing and protein expression and all sorts of things that have talked about already this year and will continue to talk about. And all of life depends on that variation, that demonstration that we see in differences between the offspring of a single mate, the offspring of various mating events, the offspring and their parents. So, what is this variation that we see? And even if you look within your own family, if you are all 100% blood related, you don't look identical to your siblings, even if they are your full siblings. You don't look identical to your parents, and that's a really big deal and a really important point when we start talking about sexual reproduction and meiosis, because that's going to be a huge driving factor for the variation in populations that allows evolution to work. So keep in mind that offspring don't directly inherit physical traits from their parents. They inherit the genes that give them the instructions for those physical traits. So when we talk about genes, right, these are units of heredity. They're segments of DNA that have a specific sequence. And that specific sequence then drives the sequence for the protein, and the protein really is the physical expression of those genes. So when we look at the difference between genotype versus phenotype, you are truly inheriting the genotype from your parents. What is the sequence of DNA? And then it's up to your cells to be able to accurately listen to those instructions and produce the proteins that give you those physical traits. So when we pass on those genes, we pass on that DNA, it really comes down to reproductive cells, your gametes. Males have sperm, females have eggs. And each gene within our genome has a specific location or specific locus on a chromosome. So when we go to putting your chromosomes back together, when we go through fertilization, we need to ensure that the same information that you are getting from that egg from the maternal side is at the same location in your chromosomes as it is for the location of that same gene in your maternal chromosome that dad's passing on via the sperm, so that your cells know where to go looking for it. And then it's the interplay between the two copies of those genes. What you would have probably learned as a genome saying capital A versus lowercase a, right? And you always have two letters. Um, that really is the sequence from dad's chromosome, the sequence from mom's chromosome that now are interplaying within your cells to dictate the types of proteins you create, how those proteins interact, which then translates to the physical characteristics that you have. And that's the idea of those homologous chromosomes. So you get a set of chromosomes from each parent. So when we talk about a human cell having 46 chromosomes, we can just as easily say it's 23 pairs of chromosomes. 23 chromosomes came from your mother, 23 chromosomes came from your dad, and they each carry the same information. It's just duplicated. And then it's a question of what variation within the specifics of those genes dictates whether you have brown eyes or blue eyes, whether you are short or tall, because of the interactions with those proteins that those individual chromosomes then produce within your cells. So let's take a step back, and since we're focusing on reproduction here, there are two big types of reproductive pathways that cells have evolved over our Earth history. So you have sexual reproduction, which is really what we're going to focus on mostly here in chapter 13, but we can't ignore the asexual reproduction either. So if I sort of take the big picture, what are some basic components of these types of reproduction? Well, when I talk sexual reproduction, requires two parents, requires those gametes to join together, go through fertilization, produce a zygote, and then ultimately produce the mature offspring. So half of the DNA comes from each parent. As a result of that, you are genetically different from your parents. This is going to involve the process of meiosis. Meiosis, its big function is to take your diploid number and cut it in half so that each of those gametes has a haploid number of chromosomes. So taking 46 chromosomes out of your cells and ensuring that each of your eggs or each of your sperm only has 23 chromosomes to pass on, so that when it joins another gamete, the other 23 chromosomes, come back together to make 46 chromosomes in the cells of that offspring. So when we look at sexual reproduction, we're talking most multicellular organisms, most plants will fall within that category. Your asexual reproduction is now a single cell or single organism being able to duplicate its genes and divide, and that's going to more often than not fall on mitosis. So these offspring are genetically identical to the parents as well as to each other. So they are all what we would consider clones. All right. When we look at asexual reproduction in things like the hydra, the yeast, the planaria, some plants, those last three bullets here, right? These are all the ones that are utilizing the mitosis. Bacteria, remember, don't have a true nucleus, so they do a very simplistic version, what we call binary fission, right? They're just going to duplicate their genetic information and split their cells because they don't have that nucleus, so it's not truly mitosis. When we look at these from an evolutionary standpoint, asexual reproduction has its own unique challenges because remember that natural selection is driven by variation in a population. I need variation. I need differential survival and differential reproductive success so that some organisms with a certain set of traits is more adaptive to their environment and as a result survives, reproduces more often, and is able to adjust the gene pool of that population over time. While asexually reproducing organisms are clones. They're genetically identical to each other and to their parents. There is inherently no variation within their population. So there are going to be other ways in which they manage to gain that variation above and beyond just simple mutation. We talked a little bit about things like transformation and transduction and conjugation when we talked about bacteria, all different ways that those bacterial species are able to get different genetic information out of their environment or from each other without actually sexually reproducing. That's a big deal. That's how they can gain that variation and get around that sort of evolutionary challenge. The benefit, however, of being an asexually reproducing organism, I don't have to go out and search for a mate. I don't need any other cells in order to make my offspring, and so the energy requirement for their reproduction is considerably lower. I look at sexual reproduction on the other hand, and now I do have that inherent cost of finding a mate, mating itself. And a lot of these offspring then also pour quite a bit of energy and resources into the production of their offspring themselves. However, the incredible benefit of sexual reproduction from an evolutionary standpoint is that you're genetically different. Not only are you genetically different from your parents, which is a big deal, every different mating event is different. Even if the parents of that mating event are the same for multiple events, their offspring aren't identical to each other either. And that's all going to come down to the way that meiosis works. So if you remember any of this from your underclassmen biology, you probably talked about things like independent assortment and crossing over and the way that we get genetic variation even into those individual egg and sperm cells in your own body before you then pass that cell on to the next generation. Let alone talk about random mating, where you can mate with multiple partners and mix up the genetic information that way. So the amount of variation that we can get from sexual reproduction is just ginormous. And that is a huge, huge benefit that very much outweighs the cost of the energy that's necessary for the actual event to take place. So just to kind of refresh yourself, right, here's some of the basics of that asexual reproduction. There's the binary fission again that we talked about a few times now. Just prokaryotes dividing in half, copying their circular chromosome as they do it. When we look at budding, this is common in things like hydra and yeast are just two examples here, where they will go through mitosis. They will literally make their offspring sort of off the side of themselves. You can see there that's a hydra in the picture, and their little bud, their little offspring is being produced via mitosis. Once that bud is mature enough to survive on its own, it will pinch off of that original parent and go off and be its own free living organism. Fragmentation there on the end, this is the splitting of a parent into two pieces, and those two pieces, or multiple pieces sometimes even, will grow into new organisms. So I just gave you a few examples there. Planaria are these little guys that you're seeing here in the picture. They're little flatworms, and if you cut them just right without damaging their basically their nerve cord in the center, you can get them to split in a petri dish. It's kind of cool. Some of you guys may have the opportunity, depending on what sort of classes you take in college or professors that you have, you may actually get to demonstrate this. I did in my biology classes in college. So you just have to be very careful though. You take just a little snippet out of their head here, right, and a little snippet out of their tail, and they will actually go ahead and split right down the middle into two planaria, which is pretty cool. The tricky part is not damaging their nerve cord in the process, because that just kills them. Sea stars. These are another example of fragmentation. We got ourselves in quite a bit of trouble with the fact that these guys do fragment in the kelp forests off the west coast. Before we really realized what we were doing, we were driving motorized boats through the kelp forests, chopping up sea stars, not really realizing what we were doing, and they can be incredibly ferocious eaters. And so they did a lot of damage, among other things, to these big kelp forests. So they're, at least last I was understanding, not allowed to drive motorized boats through those kelp forests anymore, partly to help maintain the current sea star population as opposed to just letting it explode, because we were chopping them up into little pieces and allowing them to reproduce as a result of that. So we're going to spend most of our time here in chapter 13 talking sexual reproduction, right? So this is the union of gametes. This is the sperm and the egg, and they produce that zygote, that fertilized egg, via that fertilization process. So those gametes are going to actually get produced from that diploid adult via their germ cells. Those germ cells go through meiosis and then produce haploid gametes. So if you're a male, then you're producing haploid sperm. If you're female, you're producing haploid eggs. So we're going to take our 46 chromosomes, because we're humans. If this were another organism, that number would be different. but our diploid number is 46. Take those diploid germ cells, go through meiosis, produce our haploid gametes, and those are only having 23 chromosomes each. And that's really important because when we bring these guys back together via fertilization, we want to ensure that that diploid zygote that we produce has the correct number of chromosomes so that it can reproduce later on in its life, mature, divide, grow, develop as it's supposed to. Um, so meiosis, its major component is to cut that chromosome number in half so that we are not doubling the generation chromosome number every time we make a new generation. If we never did this and just produced those gametes via mitosis, each of those eggs or sperm would have 46 chromosomes. I'd then go join 46 with 46. Well, now I'm up to 92 chromosomes. All right, and if I did it again, then I'm doubling that number again and again and again. And if you know anything about having extra chromosomes, you know your cells don't do very well with that. Down syndrome, for example, has just a single extra chromosome, and we can see the developmental and physical differences that result from that. So our cells are not evolutionarily designed to deal with that extra information. And so meiosis is a really big component to ensuring that that doesn't happen. So we cut that chromosome number in half as a result to ensure that those homologous chromosomes, one set from each parent, then comes back together in those fertilized zygotes. And they're homologous in the sense that they are the same length, they should contain the same genes, not that the code for every gene has to be identical, um, but that the same information can be found at the same location. Sort of think of it like me handing you two textbooks, one in English, one in Spanish. The same kind of information is in the same place, but the way in which that information is presented isn't necessarily the same. So when I go looking for the eye color gene, it should be on the same location from your maternal chromosome as it is in your paternal chromosome, but the actual DNA sequence may be a little different. If mom is passing on a blue gene versus dad giving you a brown gene, the sequence is going to be different because they're ultimately going to produce slightly different proteins. Um, so same length, same location for the same type of genetic information. And then when we look at them and we stain them and band them, and things like karyotypes that we'll talk a little bit more about, they should look and stain the same.